Welcome to Levine Museum of the New South. Thank you for joining us for what is our third annual celebration of Juneteenth. I am Dr. Willie Griffin, the staff historian here at Levine. I'm going to give you a brief history of the origins of the Juneteenth and a historical analysis of how we got to this point from the earliest beginning up until present here in Charlotte. And I'll begin. This is the Juneteenth flag that was designed a few years ago. And so the flag is designed to represent the history and freedom of enslaved Africans and their descendants. The design depicts a bursting new star on the horizon. It's a symbol that gives us the opportunity to recognize American freedom and African-American history. The star represents the Star of Texas, and it is bursting with new freedom throughout the land over a new horizon, a new freedom and a new people. Over the past few years, many more Americans across the United States have begun to celebrate Juneteenth. This year, those numbers are expected to continue to rise due largely to the increasing awareness of the importance of African-American history. Today, we celebrate the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about the origins of the celebration. The name Juneteenth combines the words June and 19th, the day in 1865 when enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas were informed that slavery had been abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation. The notification came a full 2 years after President Lincoln had signed the proclamation on January 1st, 1863. This map shows the states that were targeted by the Emancipation Proclamation. The emancipation story that most people in the United States learn centers around Abraham Lincoln's freeing of enslaved African Americans. But most people don't know that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all enslaved African Americans in the United States. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln said that in 100 days he would free all slaves in areas not then under Union control. So on January 1st, 1863, he named those 10 states in which the proclamation would apply. And these states were considered the rebellious states. They included Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Virginia, Kentucky, and Louisiana. And so these states were still in rebellion against the United States in 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation did not, however, cover the nearly 500,000 enslaved African Americans living in slaveholding border states that included Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware, which were under Union control. So those enslaved Africans were freed by later separate state and federal actions. Constitutionally speaking, the 13th Amendment that was issued on January 31st, 1865 is what abolished slavery, except for the punishment of crime. So now back to Galveston. Today, Galveston, Texas is a coastal resort city and port off the south coast of Texas. But when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it was the most western seaport in the southern slave kingdom that emerged in the United States between the 1820s and the 1860s. Now, the logical question that most people ask is, why did it take so long for enslaved African Americans to find out that they were free, and why were there so many enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas during this time? This map shows the spread of slavery before the start of the Civil War. And so you can see around 1820, there were only a few spots where slave populations flourished. You see on the border of North Carolina and Virginia, the border and across South Carolina and into Georgia, Alabama, places in Tennessee and Louisiana. But by 1860, you can see the Cotton Kingdom, as it was often referred, spread roughly from the north of North Carolina all the way into Texas, where Galveston is located. So this last map that I want to show you actually I want to share with you. It indicates where the major Civil War battles occurred. So in examining this map, it is important to understand that after Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Union forces determined that they would no longer return enslaved African Americans. So essentially, those enslaved African Americans in the South became known as what we call contraband. And what you begin to see is that plantation owners were making efforts to move their human property so that they could not be confiscated if when Union forces invaded the South. So this helps us understand why it took so long for news about the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the war, and the 13th Amendment to travel to Texas, because this is where plantation owners took their enslaved property. And so this is a sketch that shows a rendering of Confederate officers transporting enslaved Africans across the South into Texas. General John Bankhead McGirter had been in charge of the Texas district in 1863, or from 1863 to 1864. He wrote to one of the new state senators about his concern with the removal of slaves to Texas. Quote, I am told that over 150,000 Negroes have gone from Missouri and Arkansas into Texas, end quote. So now most historians believe that this is a high estimate. Estimates of the number of slaves transported during the Civil War to Texas from Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi range between 50,000 to 150,000. So learning about the history of Juneteenth can help illustrate the complexity of this time in our history. Most Americans believe a more simplified narrative about the end of the Civil War or the end of slavery, that it just happened, and that there's really no need to thoroughly examine this period, which couldn't be further from the truth. So now to June 19th, 1865. On that summer day in Galveston, Texas, a full 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and it was 4 months after the 13th Amendment and 2 months after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Major General Gordon Granger, commander of the U.S. Army Department of Texas, delivered the news to perhaps the very last enslaved people to learn that they were free. After reading from the General Order Number 3 that, quote, all slaves are free, Major Granger continued, quote, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and the rights of property between the former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect a military post and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. This article to the right came out of the New York Times, and it's from July 7th, 1865, a few months after the Emancipation Proclamation, or after the notification in Galveston was read. So the article recounts Granger's arrival and provides details about other general orders like number 4, which said that former Confederate officers were required to report for parole and turn in weapons. Order number 5 said the sale and shipment of cotton had to be handled through proper Treasury agents who were connected to the Union. Absolute equality, while a few million enslaved folks had learned at various times over the previous couple years that they were free, and no doubt rejoiced in the news, this day was somehow different. As the last to learn of their absolute equality with their former masters, these enslaved men, women, and children were major characters in the end of one story filled with really this long-standing oppression and the beginning of a powerful new long story filled with this hope for equality. Susan Ross was a enslaved African at this time, a newly freed African American, and she recounted her memory of the event. She said that, quote, when my oldest brother heard we were free, He gave a whoop and ran and jumped a high fence and told Mamie goodbye. Then he grabbed me up and hugged and kissed me and said, "Brother is gone. Don't expect you'll ever see me anymore." I don't know where he went, but I never did see him again. And so it just goes to show you the ecstatic nature of these newly freed Americans, and many people did many different things. In this case, her brother knew that he wanted to be nowhere around where he had been enslaved and left. So this watershed moment between these two stories of slavery and freedom has really been missing from our collective understanding of the country's history, and it presents a more fuller picture of freedom. It's no wonder that these newly freed people met the announcement with cheers, shouts, and celebrations. And so these celebrations that have continued every year since. Um, so the promise, again, the promise of absolute equality was not realized with emancipation, and it remained elusive. Oppression lingers in many of these institutions, even to this day, even though the country is struggling with these issues, very issues right now. But Juneteenth was and still is worthy of celebration and remembrance through children's books, through annual celebrations, and that begin with formerly enslaved Texans, and through the classroom teaching. We should have Juneteenth on our radar. It should be part of our collective knowledge of freedoms, of the freedom struggles in this country, so that today's youth can continue to fight fight to ensure that the promise of absolute equality is realized. Now I want to talk about some of the interesting characteristics of the earliest celebrations. Um, Dress was really important, was a really important element of the early Juneteenth customs. It is often still taken seriously, particularly by the direct descendants who can make connections to the tradition's roots. During slavery, there were laws on the books in many areas that prohibited or limited the dressing of enslaved, of those who were enslaved. During the initial days of the emancipation celebrations, there were accounts of former slaves tossing their ragged garments in the creeks and rivers to adorn clothing that they had taken from plantations that had been formerly owned by their masters. In the early years, little interest existed outside of African American community in the participation of these celebrations. In some cases, there were outwardly exhibited resistance by barring the use of public property for these festivities. Most of the festivities found themselves out in rural areas around rivers and creeks that could provide additional activities such as fishing, horseback riding, and barbecues. Often the church grounds were also sites of such activities. Eventually, what you begin to see is African Americans begin to acquire land, and land was donated and dedicated for these festivities. One of the earliest documented purchases that was named, that was sort of provided for African Americans to celebrate Juneteenth was organized by this gentleman that you see in the slide, Reverend Jack Yates. And so his fundraising efforts initially yielded over $1,000, and they purchased what has now become Emancipation Park, that you see in the bottom of the slide in Houston, Texas. It's recently been redesigned and updated. The largest Juneteenth celebration in Texas happened in Mexia, Texas. The local Juneteenth organization purchased what was Booker T. Washington Park, and it became the Juneteenth celebration site in 1898. There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted and halted by white landowners demanding that their laborers return to work. However, it seems that most were allowed their workers the day off, and some even made donations for food and money. For decades, the annual celebrations flourished, growing continuously with each passing year. In Booker T. Washington Park, as many as 20,000 African Americans flowed through the course of a week, making the celebration one of the largest in the state. So the Juneteenth celebrations really began to decline at the turn of the 20th century, really due to economic, political, and cultural forces. So as in the Southeast, for instance, celebrations were always discouraged, especially following the collapse of Reconstruction. Classroom and textbooks, education in lieu of traditional home and family taught practices stifled the interest of youth due to less emphasis and details on the activities of former slaves. Classroom textbooks proclaimed that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, as the date of signaling the end of slavery, and little or nothing more on the impact of General Granger's arrival in June 19th was ever really mentioned in any of these textbooks. And so if we move forward into the 1920s, the Depression forced many people off the farms and into cities to find work. And really in these urban environments, employers were less eager to really grant leave to celebrate this date. So unless June 19th fell on a weekend or a holiday, there were very few participants available. July 4th was already established as Independence Day, as an independence holiday, and the rise of patriotism steered more toward this celebration. So now we just want to talk just a little about local celebrations in the state of North Carolina and here in Charlotte. In most cases, this article from 1873 is the first article that I was able to find that actually mentioned the celebration of emancipation. And this comes from the Charlotte Democrat. And so it talks about how African Americans were really discouraged to celebrate. And one of the reasons that they were discouraged to celebrate was because employers thought that they were losing wages and they were losing money. And so it says that white men who pay their debts and don't live off the earnings of other people never lose time by engaging in foolish parades and so-called festivals or church fairs. And so this was really the general stance of politicians throughout North Carolina who didn't really see fit for African Americans to celebrate their freedom. The first statewide celebration in North Carolina was held in 1892, and it coincided with the rise of the populist movement that brought poor whites and African Americans together under one political party. Here you see the then governor of North Carolina, Thomas M. Holt. He pointed out in the initial celebration, he wanted to highlight what the white population had done for African Americans' advancement, particularly in terms of providing education funding. And he encouraged African Americans to acquire land and to try to become in the fullest sense, citizens. Local celebrations actually began to emerge here in Charlotte in 1893. This is an image of Dr. John Taylor Williams, J.T. Williams, who presided over the Men's Colored Patriotic Club at the Colored Pavilion. And so what they did was celebrate by having a cakewalk. And I'm not sure if I can show you, this is sort of an example of what a cakewalk looked like. So you can see here just how important dress was to them. They dressed in their best tuxedos and gowns, and they exaggerated their movements just to show that they had adopted what was really considered American culture. And so they wanted to show that they were assimilating and that, that they were now free. And so the significance of the Black church is really important to understand in these early emancipation celebrations. Every New Year, you will find some African Americans in church, and most don't really understand that this connection is really connected to the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, earlier in the presentation, I talked about how 100 days before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Abraham Lincoln notified the country that he would be issuing it. And so many African Americans on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation gathered waiting for this proclamation to be issued. And so even today you have African Americans traditionally go to church as night watch for the new year, but most don't really talk about its connection to the Emancipation Proclamation. Grace AME Zion and First Baptist Church. This is a picture of Zachariah Alexander, who was the founder of the Alexander Funeral Home here, one of the oldest Black institutions in the city, and he often presided over some of these early celebrations. Another person who presided over these celebrations was Bishop George W. Clinton, who was the bishop of the AME Zion Church. And so in his sort of the characteristics of his talks during the celebration, he talked about the importance of political representation, gaining the right to vote, and again, the accumulation of wealth in the form of land. And so these were the kinds of things that they talked about as sort of examples of the things that they should be celebrating on Emancipation Day, which turned into Juneteenth all across the country. These celebrations really ceased to exist between the 1930s and 1960s. But what you begin to see, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s yielded both positive and negative results for the Juneteenth celebration. While it pulled many African American youth away and into the struggle of racial equality, many linked these struggles to the historical struggles of their ancestors. And so this was evidenced by student demonstrations in the Atlanta Civil Rights Campaign buttons. Again, in the 60s. And so they wore these Juneteenth freedom buttons in the civil rights movement. In 1868, Juneteenth received another strong resurgence through the Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. Reverend Ralph Abernathy called for people of all races and creeds and economic levels and professions to come to Washington and show support for the poor. Many of these attendees returned home and initiated Juneteenth celebrations in areas that where they had previously been absent. So in fact, two of the largest Juneteenth celebrations founded after this march are now held in Milwaukee and Minneapolis, which is really ironic, considering what we're dealing with as a country now. On January 1st, 1980, Juneteenth became the official state holiday through the efforts of Al Edwards, pictured here. He was an African-American state legislator. The successful passage of this bill marked the Juneteenth as the first emancipation celebration granted by an official state recognition. So Edwards has since actively sought to spread the observance of Juneteenth all across the country. And so in modern times today, Juneteenth is really enjoying a phenomenal growth rate within the communities and organizations throughout the country. Institutions such as the Smithsonian, the Henry Ford Museum, and other have begun sponsoring Juneteenth-centered activities. As I stated at the top, this is our third annual celebration of Juneteenth here at Levine. In recent years, a number of local and national Juneteenth organizations have risen to take place alongside older organizations to help promote and cultivate this knowledge around African American history. Here in Charlotte, the Festival of the Carolinas, started by Pap Njai, owner of the House of Africa, started Juneteenth Festival over 20 years ago. Juneteenth Today celebrates the African American freedom and achievement while encouraging continuous self-development and respect for all culture. As it takes on more national and symbolic and even global perspective, the events of 1865 in Texas are not forgotten, for all the roots tie back to this fertile soil from which the National Day of Pride is growing. So the future for Juneteenth looks bright as a number of cities and states are creating Juneteenth committees, and they continue to increase. Respect and appreciation for all of our differences grow out of this exposure and working together to celebrate the country turning towards its effort to become a true democracy. So getting involved in supporting Juneteenth celebrations help create new bonds for friendship and understanding among us. So indeed, the future is bright for Juneteenth. And I'll end the presentation here.
Hey everyone, this is James E. Ford. I'm a Charlotte resident, an educator, activist, and a ordained minister as well. So wanted to come on here first and foremost to wish everybody a happy Juneteenth, or as it's also known, African American Independence Day. I'm a proud African American, proud of that lineage and that heritage. And I want to talk a little bit today about what exactly that means, specifically from the perspective of our verbal and oral traditions and our religious traditions as well. First and foremost, when I say that I'm African American, it doesn't mean that I'm just black. That much is obvious. It means that I literally descend from enslaved Africans in America. So those who are celebrating emancipation on this day in Texas, that we now know as Juneteenth, those are the group of people, the ethnic group of people that I descend from. And oftentimes when people say, well, you don't, African American, they may say, well, don't say African because, I don't speak any African languages. I don't know what tribe that I come from. I've never been to Africa. And while that may be true, when we talk about being African descended people, we're not just talking about language. We're talking about culture. And in many ways, that culture has been passed down through generations and forms and in fashions that we don't always recognize. And whereas we may not know that certain things are African, I can guarantee you are a lot of things that we retained, we kept from generation to generation that we're just not clear are actually African traditions. So one of those things is the love of words, the understanding of the power of words, also known in West African traditions as Nomo. That's Nommo. And Nomo is essentially the power of words to bring harmony, to bring life, and to bring balance, the power of spoken word. And when you think about the way that black folk engage, we kind of say, there are things that are different about us. And we say, well, that's just how black folks are. But this loving of words, whether it be through music, whether it be through storytelling, whether it be through preaching and speaking, that's fundamentally who we are. And that's not something that we invented. That's something that we got passed down through generations and generations from our ancestors. It's part of what makes us African descended folks. And so even though that has evolved and it's created its own culture, new African cultures in the United States of America, it's something, and it's cool to say, that we get from our ancestors. Even if you think about like the way people consider what is true history. I'm a former history teacher, and for a lot of historians, they say that history is what is written down, because for more white or European American people, they tend to view history as only that which is written down on paper or written down in some other medium. And while that's fine, the problem with that is that most African descended people, we come from what are called oral traditions, meaning that we speak and say a lot of our history and a lot of the important stories. A lot of the important information is conveyed verbally. And if it's not written down, that doesn't mean that it's less important or that it's not accurate or that it's not reliable. It just means that it's different. It's a different way of recounting these things and retelling these things. And so, a lot of, and particularly in West African villages, instead of having a log or a book that kind of retold or kept the history of a particular tribe or village, what they had were griots or griots, if you prefer. And these were the resident storytellers of those communities. They kept all the stories about, particular family members, the stories of community, and they trained other people to tell these stories as well. And it was these people kind of stood as the village spokespersons. And through these stories, they collected and retained information, and they'd be passed down. I think about my own grandfather, who himself was like our griot in our family. He'd always sit us down and tell us stories, and he'd tell us stories about Brer Rabbit or the tortoise and the hare, or any of what we can consider to be like fables or myths, like Aesop's fables. Those are the sort of stories and traditions that Africans and African descended people like African Americans, that characterizes our form of speech. And, one of the coolest things ever for me was to allow for the first time my then girlfriend and my now wife, who is herself from Africa. She's from West Africa, a country called Ghana. And her meeting my grandfather for the first time My grandfather is, of course, African American, a former sharecropper who, immediately after slavery, that's what a lot of black people in the South did. They still planted, but they were kept in debt. They never really got ownership. And her telling my grandfather, who loved to tell stories, the stories that she had heard in her village. And one of the stories she told, my grandfather looked up and he said, I've heard that story before. My father used to tell me that story. And so it was this really cool moment of connection between hearing my wife, who is from the continent of Africa, and my grandfather, who obviously is African American and descends from Africa. And despite there being this big old gap, there's thousands of miles of ocean, the Atlantic, that separated them two, culturally there was that connection right there in that moment. The other thing you have to understand about us is that our patterns of speech, the way that we communicate is different. And when I say different, I don't mean that in any sort of negative way. Different does not mean bad. Different does not mean deficient. It just means different. We're boisterous. We are expressive with our language, with our tone. It's rhythmic. It's musical. The way that we interact, and that's what makes us who we are. When we verbally communicate, we like to rap. And by rap, I don't necessarily mean the traditional form of rap that you're probably used to, although that's part of our tradition. I mean to rhapsodize. Rap comes from the word rhapsodize, and it means to speak fluently, or it means to speak in a flow. And so when you think about a rapper, you talk about the flow. That's literally what it means to be able to spew and to be able to communicate words in a fluent manner. But this is something that we've seen even in the churches. The men and women of words, the folks who get up there, the pastors who deliver a sermon, and the way that they communicate, the discourses that they use, the stories and the allegories that they use. This is all a part of our communication tradition. It's what it means to be African American. For any of y'all who've ever been in a black church setting, you know that a lot of times the preacher get to, singing and humming while they're talking. And, in addition to that, they engage in something called call and response. And so that means that the preacher may say something like, can I get an amen? And the crowd is supposed to respond with the amen. Or if the preacher says God is good all the time, then the crowd responds. They know to respond by saying, and all the time God is good. These are the things that characterize our patterns of speech. They are our rhetorical traditions, our communication styles, and they translate to our culture. But we get those from our ancestors, those folks who we have never met. And they're what make us African descended peoples. But what's even cooler than that is it's not just the way that we talk or the way that we interact or the music and the culture that we make as a result of those patterns. It's actually the way that we see things. So when you go back to the church and you think about the ways that black people, the ways that African Americans even read the Bible, the way that they interpret it has led to totally different traditions, some of which are called Black liberation theology traditions. And liberation meaning freedom, the struggle for freedom, and theology meaning the study of God, right? So when we talk about God and we read the Bible, a lot of times black people think about God differently. And that's because of what we've experienced through slavery, etc. So for African Americans, when we read, chapters in the book of Exodus, and we read about stories like Moses confronting Pharaoh, this big, powerful guy in Egypt, and demanding that he set my people free, let my people go. When we read that as African Americans, our ancestors read that and they said to themselves, well, now I may not know any Hebrews, but if this story is true, then it sounds to me like the God that they're talking about is on the side of the oppressed, is on the side of the enslaved, is on the side of the brutalized, and on the side of those who've been pushed away, those who've been cast aside, those who've been mistreated. And so we began to see ourselves in those stories. And it empowered a lot of us to be able to call for the abolition of slavery. And we began to tell ourselves that we believe God himself wanted black people to be free because he wanted the enslaved people in Egypt to be free as well. But beyond just the story of Moses and Pharaoh, when we even read about Jesus. Black liberation theology takes a totally different approach. And it comes from the tradition started by a man named Reverend Dr. James H. Cone. He's considered the father of Black liberation theology. And it was James Cone who first began to introduce the world to the idea that maybe Jesus was Black. And by saying Jesus was Black, he didn't necessarily mean that Jesus was of African descent or had brown skin, which maybe he did, right? That's quite possible. What he meant by saying that he was Black was that when you look at how Black people are treated in the United States of America, that Jesus was like a Black person, that he was born into a family that didn't have a whole lot of wealth or a whole lot of means or a lot of resources, that he belonged to an ethnic group that was mistreated, that he lived and grew up in the heart of Roman Empire, a big bad government who didn't treat people with respect, who often killed people, and that by challenging that authority is what ultimately got him crucified or hung out to dry and in some cases lynched, right? That's one way to look at it, is that on one hand, you have the cross, the two wooden sticks and being hung out to dry that way. And in America, African Americans were hung from trees, and for very similar reasons, right? As for why Jesus was crucified. And so there began to be parallels. We began to use theology and the Black experience to look at things and look at the various parallels. And so our interpretation, the way that we even look at, and the lens that we look through to see the Bible, to understand God, is characterized by our Blackness, is characterized by our experience as African Americans in the heart of empire, and in the heart of the most powerful nation on earth, oftentimes under the yoke of oppression, oftentimes being mistreated, belonging to a small ethnic minority. We begin to see Jesus through that lens, and that leads to what is known as a Black liberation theology. And whereas Dr. Cone is known as sort of the father, there are other descendants, even like Jeremiah Wright, who used to be Barack Obama's pastor when he was running for the president of the United States. And so that tradition carries on. I consider myself a practitioner of Black liberation theology. And so we have a good heritage that we ought to be proud of, and on this day that we ought to take a moment to celebrate. Now, you heard me say before that we're people of words, and that we understand the power of Nomo and the power of the spoken word, and that we like to tell stories, and we like to tell rhymes, and we like to engage in alliteration. I'm also an MC, which means that I understand the power of words, that I wield those words, and I craft those words to communicate messages. And when you think about rap music and hip hop culture, it's another branch from the same tree and the same trunk of African descended people. And so to illustrate what I mean and what I've been talking about, I want to perform a little piece, a little verse, a couple verses for y'all. It's called Truth to Power. Even in utero, I knew I was soon to flow. Lyric through umbilical, I spit it so that you would know the truth. Born with justice on my lips, and I'm quick to draw like a gun is on my hip. Modern day prophet, trumpet of truth up in this booth. Providing skeptics who haven't had enough with the proof. I will jump through the hoops of fire just for the youth. Entangled up in the web of lies, I'm cutting you loose. This for young and old alike. Cause when I'm holding mics, it's the prototype for doing simply what you know is right. So I'ma hold the light. Better yet, the torch, marching through the thick of the forest and through the coldest nights. For better or worse, I let it disperse. And I commit myself to tell it till I'm dead in the hearse. And you could hear it in the words of each and every verse. So when I'm gone on my headstone, let it be known I speak truth to the powers that be, as loud as can be. Make sure I'm heard, even if they ain't acknowledging me. So if you illiterate or got a college degree, I will fear no evil as long as God is in me. I speak truth to the powers that be, as loud as can be. Make sure I'm heard, even if they ain't acknowledging me. Whether you illiterate or got a college degree, I continue to speak the truth. This ain't hating. This is love at its greatest. And no one wants to say this. Don't care if I'm number one on your playlist. It's word, sound, power. The wretched of the earth screaming from a strong tower, beaming down sun showers, meaning that we illuminate and shine the rays breaking through the storm clouds, attempting to change a gloomy fate. So either get on or get left. It's no pawns or missteps, or slide to the side because I got moves to make. The tongue is ultra sharp. And if you know the art, you know that what we say pierces flesh and it goes for the heart. They let you live like a king long as you know your part. Make sure that you don't do a thing to try to show you're smart. The world is at your command, and before you let it slip, have some talcum powder on hand. I'm saying get a grip. The time is now when I'm going to show you how to bring an empire to its knees. This is fire that I breathe.
Thank you for joining the Levine Museum in our annual celebration of Juneteenth. Stay tuned for part 3 of our celebration.